Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum here at the Harvard Kennedy School. My name is Trey Grayson. I'm the director of the Institute of Politics. We're glad to have all of you with us this evening. Tonight's conversation is going to be moderated by Ginny Hunt. Ginny is an IOP fellow with us this semester. I was going to say she runs Google, but that's not exactly right? Not yet, anyway. So I got her exact title. So she's a principal for strategy and civic innovation. And where we got to know her and where she's become a longtime friend of the IOP and of the Kennedy School, she was one of the founder of the public sector engineering team and was on the politics and elections initiative and worked with a whole host of professors, students, and a few startups that germinated here at the Kennedy School. So she's been a great fellow this semester. We're really glad to have her with us, but we're especially glad to have her tonight in the forum, and she's going to introduce our speaker. So please join me in welcoming Jenny.
Thanks, Trey, and it's great to be here. As most of you know, we're in the middle of a major macro-level shift from centralized hierarchies to decentralized networks, facilitated by the internet. And the internet, which across many sectors has created disruption, but also transformation, resulting in radically better models, in some case, for how industries and sectors work. But in the public sector, we've seen destabilization from the Arab Spring to Anonymous to what Clay will reference around Healthcare.gov without necessarily seeing radically improved models take their place. And that's why I'm glad that we have Clay with us tonight. Clay, who I often refer to as sort of the Socrates of the connected world, someone who helps us think about how complex systems can be made comprehensible and also how the digital can be made humane, which I think at this point in our history is important for all of us to understand. So Clay, who is a best-selling author, a professor, a Berkman Fellow, a father, an eternal optimist, is going to talk with us a bit tonight about a few of the major shifts we're seeing at this point at the intersection of government and technology, in particular looking at Healthcare.gov and what this means for all of us moving forward. After he makes a few remarks, we'll then open it up to discussion with you. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that introduction. And I should say, too, this is a little bit of a homecoming. I was very fortunate to have a visiting lectureship at the Shorenstein Center a few years ago, so this is a homecoming of sorts as well. And ixnay on the Ocrates say. I think we can leave it at that. Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about what we can learn about the internet and civic value around the launch of Healthcare.gov. And I specifically don't want to talk about what we can learn about the internet and partisan politics around the launch of Healthcare.gov. So threading that needle is a little bit complicated. But I think one of the big changes we've just seen with the launch is the normalization of the internet as a core service platform for essential functions of government. The Affordability Care Act was the first time Congress drafted legislation in which a website was directed to be set up to communicate with the American people and to provide this function, right? That was already a big change a couple of years ago. But on October 1st, it was the first time that such a thing was practically launched. So part of the change was just this had come into being. But part of the change was that in an environment of essentially hyper-partisanship, anything that could be criticized about that launch was criticized, has been criticized, continues to be criticized. But no one said the web is a bad idea for this kind of service. Right? There are people who complain vociferously about the Affordable Care Act in general. There are people who complain vociferously about the website underperforming. But no one has said it was a bad idea to use the web in the first place. And when the website didn't perform, all of the fallback options, which are all of the normal ways that governments interact with their citizens, call on the phone, send a fax, here's a paper product, were all thought to be distinctly second-rate. So this marks, I think, this moment marks the fusion of what the internet makes possible with what is politically possible in this country. That change was a little bit hard to see. That was a kind of the dog that didn't bark in the night change. And in the middle of all of the uproar around Healthcare.gov, that change was hard to see. But I think that is the marker we have just passed, which is it is now assumed to be not just a normal, but a good and stable way to deliver complicated service to the American people. Now, plainly, the website itself has generated an enormous amount of concern because of its poor performance. And I think there's a lesson there as well. There's been a huge conversation among people concerned that the government do technology right about how an administration that did such an amazing job of getting itself into office in 2008 and then re-elected in 2012 could have launched something that did not work nearly as well as the Obama for America efforts in 2008 and 2012. But I think that is part of this Rubicon we have just passed, we have just crossed. Internet technology and politics have hooked up every 2 years since 1992, when Bill Clinton famously used a mailing list hosted over at MIT to run his famous war room during his original election effort. But that every 2-year cycle has only been around elections. What we're seeing now is not internet technology and politics hooking up. Now they've gotten married, right? The normal case of using the internet and the internet technologies to deliver civically important services is different from just trying to do it during an election. And it comes with very significant constraints, right? There are all kinds of checks and balances that we expect around using essentially the government building services which checks and balances don't have to exist during an election. So there is now a big conversation about essentially what went wrong and what could be done better, right? And there are a lot of ideas floating around about improved procurement, improved hiring of technologists inside the government, improved management of technology projects. All of those things will help. None of those things, in my view, would have solved the problem we just saw. And the thing that convinces me that the problem is more than just we didn't have good technologists, we didn't have good procurement processes. The thing that convinces me, in fact, that this is a leadership problem and not just a technology problem is that on October 1st, on launch day for Healthcare.gov, Obama got up and on a day in which the site was already having problems, Obama compared it to Amazon.com, which would have been an insane comparison even if it was working well, right? So he raised people's expectations well above what the site was capable of, especially on that day. And then he says, you don't have to take my word for it, go look for yourself. So he drives more traffic to a site which is already not doing well under the load. That is not a technology problem. That is someone being unable to tell the boss the truth, right? That is a problem of political culture. And so as much as I hope that procurement and hiring and management improve within the government, I don't think that we get to where we need to be now that the internet is a normal delivery platform for civic value. I don't think we get there without there also being a change in technology leadership. Now, as distressing as the Healthcare.gov launch has been, I also think there is an opportunity here for that change, and here's why. Right? It's clear, reading many of the post-mortems about Healthcare.gov, that the overriding rationale for many of the decisions was, let's keep the opposition from having anything to complain about. Right? Don't specify things in advance. Don't inform people of your plans. Don't let people look in, because we want to keep the opposition from complaining. They are so implacably opposed to the Affordable Care Act that we want to keep them from complaining at every moment. And the people implementing this strategy thought that they were reducing the amount of failure they were going to suffer from. But it turns out they were not reducing it, they were saving it up. And all of it came out on launch day. So even if you set aside any technological issues, even if you accept the most base inside the Beltway political calculation that this was an attempt to reduce the amount of complaining that the opposition could engage in, the strategy failed even on that measure, right? That it gave the opposition much more to complain about than if there had been small iterative failures all the way along, right? if you look at the history of large IT projects in the government, you see things like failed FAA upgrades, failed IRS upgrades, failed FBI upgrades, literally billions of dollars for projects that never launched. If technology not working was enough to precipitate a change, it would have changed already. I think, though, that what we've just seen is a failure of even the political rationale around managing projects in the way that Healthcare.gov was managed. So if we're going to see a change, the question that everybody who launches a large technology project faces is, when is reality allowed to trump planning? When does reality override planning? And in Washington, the standard answer to that question is never, right? The method favored for the development of very large-scale IT in DC is something called the waterfall method, where you do all of the planning, and then you do all of the specifications of the individual parts, and then you build all of the individual parts, and then you do all of the integration. But what the waterfall method amounts to is a solemn promise from all participants that they will learn nothing during the building of the technology, right? That they swear they will be at their smartest and most knowledgeable at exactly the moment when they have no experience with what they're about to start. And that once the planning phase ends, no new intuitions and no new thoughts will be allowed to intrude. And that model simply does not work when you are trying to do anything new. You can't do that. You can't plan everything in advance, especially when you know as little as you do. So if I am right about this, about the lesson I think we can learn from Healthcare.gov about technical leadership, it's going to manifest itself in this way. People who are trying to create civic value with new technology have to figure out how to let reality trump planning a little bit all the time, right? This is a management model sometimes called agile in technical circles, but in a way the name doesn't matter anymore because it is so imbued into the way large-scale projects work outside of the government that we almost don't need a name for it. Flickr, the photo sharing service, when they were developing the initial features, they were pushing new versions of the software in half-hour increments. Right? They would push something out, they would watch it for a while. If the users liked it, they would leave it. If they didn't like it, they would pull it back. Right? And that ability to take a large project and cut it up into little projects that you test and learn from, that's the thing to watch for in the aftermath of Healthcare.gov. If we see the people who are inside HHS and inside CMS, inside the Healthcare and Human Services, and inside Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, if we see those people saying, in the future, we have to have these little versions in which we fail a little bit all the time, then we'll know there's been a change in technical leadership. If we don't see that, I don't think that any of the other changes being proposed to make the technology, the procurement, the hiring better are going to be effective. Because if you don't get to the point where someone can tell the boss, this is not going to work, it doesn't matter how talented your techies are, because reality has to be able to move to the highest levels of the organization. I sometimes, I was watching the Healthcare.gov launch, I thought for the first 2 weeks, as many of us did, oh, this is just a problem with load. People are coming in, they're eager to sign up, and the system is just buckling under the load. It was only after a couple of weeks of the reports that I think, like a lot of people, I began to understand there are really distressingly bad engineering at the level of the platform. And I sometimes think, what could Obama have said on launch day that would have made a difference? He could have said, today's the first day of public testing. He could have said, we're only, please only use this if you're willing to give us feedback. He could have said, today we're only testing with people whose zip codes end in a 1, right? And gotten rid of 90% of the load while trying to understand what the issues were. The fact that he was allowed to go out and make a spurious comparison to Amazon and then drive traffic suggests that there was no one in that organization who could have said on October 1, hey, Chief, come here. don't make such a big deal about the website when you go out in public. And they ended up creating a situation in which not only did the political attempt to manage the failure, not only did that fail, they actually created a worse version of the problem they were trying to avoid. And it's the fact that there was a significant political problem, not just a significant technical problem, that makes me think we may be able to have a conversation about what it takes to create civic value using the internet as a platform. Because it can't launch in these giant chunks anymore. So if you want to look at what government technology done right looks like, and it distresses me there are a bunch of Democrats signing up essentially to deny that the government can do anything right. But if you want to look at what good technology looks like, look at what NASA does, right? Look at what the Pentagon does. The NSA, famously, unconstrained in their ability to hire and manage talented techies, right? Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, recently, very interesting article published that said, we knew we couldn't launch a big complicated site, but we knew we had to end up with a big complicated site. So we launched a little site, and then we changed a little bit, and learned a little bit, and launched a little bit, right? So the government is, in fact, very capable in many departments of launching significant and challenging technology. But in all of those cases, there's somebody on the inside who has significant technical authority. A, they know what the technology is, but B, they're also able to override people's sense that planning or politics has to trump reality. There's an interesting comparison between assembly lines in the 1980s, automobile assembly lines at Chrysler and Toyota. At Chrysler and in all American unionized shops, the normal case for an assembly line, when something was bad, when a part came along and it didn't fit, it was broken, it didn't light up, it didn't do what it was supposed to do, you'd take the part off and you would set it behind you and somebody would come and look later. The Toyota assembly line, every single person on the assembly line, if something came along that wasn't working, could hit a switch that caused the whole thing to come to a halt. And they could say, if something's wrong here, it's probably not a one-off. There's probably a problem upstream from me. Toyota was what, in the unlovely phrase of management theory, it's called a double loop organization. Don't love the term, but that's what people call it. Single loop organizations fix problems. That's what's going on with Healthcare.gov right now. The system is buckling under load, we'll add more servers. They can't handle the traffic, we'll improve the content delivery network. Double loop organizations fix the problem and then they fix the thing that caused the problem. We will not get civically vital technology from the government or indeed from any organization, this is as true of NGOs, without people who understand the technology also being able to hit that button. Without the people who understand the technology saying, I know what the plan is, I know what you think you want, but I am saying that as long as this process is going on and I can see a problem, we can't launch like this. If anyone inside HHS who was saying, we're not ready, we're testing and it's buckling under the load, let's try not to have a third world experience. If any of those people had been able, as long ago as March, to say, stop, do not launch this, do not let the president's reputation rest on the tool we're building, many of the fixes we're seeing now in November could have been implemented in September. But no one had the ability to create that kind of, essentially to push the knowledge of what wasn't working up the chain, which is what is required by tech leadership. So I'll end by observing something that I often ask my students to do. And it turns out to be an enormously helpful exercise and is, I think, the kind of discipline that's needed for these technology projects. When my students are in the middle of a project, I ask them to stop for a moment and write a post-mortem, the first sentence of which I write. And the first sentence is, this failed because, right? And I ask them to sit down and say, why did your project fail, right? They're in the middle of building it, they haven't launched it, they haven't tested it, and I say, why did it fail? And it's astonishing what they already know, right? People didn't understand this feature. There was nothing for them to do right when they got there, and they can actually say in advance what's going to go wrong, right? There was a great piece by Rusty Foster in The New Yorker saying, technology disasters are surprising to the people they're launched to, but it doesn't surprise anyone on the inside. People knew what was going to go wrong with Healthcare.gov well before it went wrong. And if we want to see serious change in the way the government, or indeed any large organization manages technology, that's what we have to get to. We have to get to the ability for the people who know what's going on the inside to say, this failed because, and to predict in advance, because the things that those people are able to identify are going to be much more valuable than living with the fantasy that planning can constantly override reality. So I'll stop there and figure we'll have something to talk about.
Sounds great. I think we'll have a few things.
Great.
So,
sit down here.
wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks very much. These people can't see. Let's pull this back.
What's that?
Would this pull back? No, this is
I don't know.
just these people are now completely blocked by.
We're going to rearrange things and then we'll get to a conversation. So I think, Clay, to your point on how do we create civic value and what this means moving forward, a lot of what you're talking about is really a culture shift.
Yeah.
And a culture shift that I think many have started. And we've started to see sort of a movement around civic technology and awareness of helping governments and public institutions reconcile with the reality that digital is the new norm.
Right.
So how do you think that can start to take place both incrementally, so that it's done successfully, as well as in a way that enables a risk tolerance so that not everything is labeled as the fear and doom of a failure?
Right. Well, I'll start with the second thing first. I think the risk tolerance question, that is common to big organizations in general, right? In bureaucracies that do technology badly, the commonality is that deniability is more important than accountability, and accountability is more important than effectiveness. It's more important to be able to say, I didn't break it, right? That, my fingerprints are not on that, than it is to say, yeah, we worked on that and it didn't work and here's why. And it's more important to be able to say, yeah, we worked on that and here's why, than to say, this isn't working, we're switching to plan B. The thing that makes me perversely optimistic in the middle of the difficulties with Healthcare.gov is that even the bureaucratic rationale for managing things that way has not worked. It has not shielded the ACA, the Affordability Care Act, from very significant, very pointed criticism that resonates with the American people, right? The disaster moment was not when the opposition or knowledgeable techies were talking about what had gone wrong. The disaster moment is when Jon Stewart takes it on, right? The disaster moment is when David Letterman puts it in his nightly monologue, because that's the point at which it is spilled out of the bounds of the usual suspects and become part of the general conversation. So my hope is that no one be allowed to fantasize anymore that you can launch a big, a big attempt at creating civic value without going through a lot of failure. At which point, the question becomes, do you want to jump out a one-story building 40 times, or do you want to jump out of a 40-story building once? And so far, the rationale has been, for the first 39 floors, this strategy is working great. But the saving it all up for one big hit is turning out to be harder and harder as the web gets more and more important. So I think the incremental cultural shift has to be, I think, an acceptance of failure as the norm that you have to work your way through. I mean, even NASA put a dog up first, right? That even our greatest, most successful model of it's a moonshot, right? America's great example of can-do technology did not start by putting a person on a moon, right? We started with a satellite, and then we had a dog, and then we had somebody in orbit. That model, I think, has to appear in all of these organizations. And let me say something. You have heard me blow up about this before, but the phrase "failure is not an option," which was put forward in that movie, the Apollo 13 movie, that is something screenwriters said. No engineers in NASA said that, and they didn't say it because they're engineers, and engineers would not say that. Engineers understand that failure is always an option. The reason they work so hard is that they understand that. So there was an engineer who ex post facto characterized themselves as looking for different solutions and said something about failure. The screenwriters then took that and put it into the scene as if that was a motivational statement. It's not something people in technically sophisticated cultures say to each other. If you ever say it to anybody else, wash your mouth out with soap. If anybody ever says it to you, think about changing jobs. Because that suggests you're dealing with someone who isn't willing to admit that reality bats last. And that I think, in a way, that's the big cultural change. The deep cultural change is recognizing that you can't just say failure is not an option and get anything out of that. In fact, alarmingly, someone apparently said that to Henry Chow, the deputy CIO of CMS, who was overseeing Healthcare.gov. He raised issues in two seasons ago, half a year ago, and somebody apparently said to him, failure is not an option, which should have been, and for him maybe was a sign that things were not going to go well.
I think that makes sense. So I think if we take from that, failure is almost a necessity, to your point, sort of how it becomes sort of managed throughout the process that becomes sort of the shift.
Right.
And to that point, I think what's interesting, I want to hear from your perspective, how we can enable policymakers, those that actually have come up through management structures that haven't had to manage very complex product platforms and digital platforms. How do we enable policymakers and leaders to be equipped with the knowledge of the right questions to ask, the right skills required to build the teams capable of successfully executing these types of projects?
Right. Well, I think up front there's two things. There's a carrot and a stick, right? So the stick is Healthcare.gov. The stick is you decided you were going to avoid criticism and you actually just saved it up, and then it all got dumped on you at exactly the moment of maximum public interest. Like, don't do that is the easiest lesson to draw. And then how you don't do that becomes the carrot problem. There's just a very interesting piece about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in which they said, we knew we couldn't launch a big site all at once, so we launched it in pieces and learned. So that's the carrot, which is you can show people that it is not, and CFPB, second only to the Affordable Care Act, has come under significant scrutiny, significant political scrutiny, and even in the middle of that, they managed to launch something incrementally. To the longer term, your longer term point about the internal management issues, there are, I think, two big ones. One, the organizations inside the government or inside any large company that manage technology well have people on their side. Right? The weird thing about being a contractor is just the way contracts are set up. You have this incentive to say, everything's going great, and also it's going to take twice as long, right? Because everything going great says don't fire us, and it's going to take twice as long says we're upping the billing. And so you have this weird interaction with contractors. You need someone on your side who can tell when they're blowing smoke and when they're not. Those people don't all have to work for you, but they have to be on your side. So if you look at what Jen Polka is doing with Code for America, Anil Dash and Expert Labs, Clay Johnson and the Center for Better Technology, or Department of Better Technology, those are places that are meant to hybridize with the government, but to be on the side of the people inside the organizations. Because if you don't have that, then you've really outsourced what is a critical function. But the other thing the insiders have to have is the ability to say, boss, you're not going to get this with the features you want, on the time you want, at the cost you want. Right? What's called the iron triangle in this world, which is resources, feature, time. And the conversation you need to be able to have is a conversation about options. Right? The data's fixed, what can we do to the feature set? The resources are fixed, should we trade off features or time? But you can't just say, failure is not an option, you must go back and work faster, because we know that one doesn't work. And if I could bring anything into the conversation between the people whose mind is on the civic value but are not deep in the technology and the people whose mind is in the technology, and who understand the civic value but aren't at the sort of making the fine-grained decisions, it would be to bring those people together in meetings where the discussion was not, this is a crisis, we're slipping, everything is bad, but rather, here are the options, right? Because once you start with an options conversation, you can often bring management and engineering together around an optimal, an optimal course that neither side could get to on their own. And with that, you can always manage the trade-offs. You certainly don't always succeed, but you at least always can reconvene and re-talk about the inevitable trade-offs. Without that, it's just this all the time. And this all the time is a big part of what goes wrong with large IT disasters in general.
Yeah, I definitely agree. So can you put this in context a bit? Looking at both the era that I think Obama ushered in terms of digital becoming the new norm,
right.
Sort of where we are, to your point, where you said, what was interesting around Healthcare.gov is both policymakers and citizens agreed that a website was a critical part of the policy implementation,
yep.
and then where this takes us. So where do you see this on the trajectory of the digital transition and creating civic value?
I think the fact that people thought, well, I've got to use the telephone, like
right.
this is barbaric. That change, unremarked on because so much about Healthcare.gov has been so problematic, that change suggests that there's now no service that isn't at least putatively up for rethinking in terms of digital delivery. That is a huge change. The original transition to digital service was Carl Malamud, our living national treasure of government documents, who would buy a CD-ROM from the SEC, I think they published them every 90 days, pulled the data off of it about these companies, put it up on a website, and then let the investor community, in those days mostly on Usenet, an old global bulletin board, let the investor community know, oh, you've got this SEC data, here's the URL, blah, blah, blah. And wildly popular. People could not get enough of this. And so Carl very politely tried to convince the SEC that this was creating some kind of civic value, blah, blah, blah. Nothing, nothing, nothing. Total stonewall. So he said finally, look, I'm just doing this out of the goodness of my heart. I have to buy these things once a quarter. I'm shutting this whole thing down. Sorry. Here's the SEC's phone number. And they were deluged with citizens livid that this thing, which they'd come to rely on in the space of, I think, 9 months, that was produced by the government with tax dollars was not being made publicly available. Right? That was the beginning. The government dragged kicking and screaming to share this stuff. I think the lesson of this change is we've moved to a place where it's now the low energy state to think we can use these tools to communicate directly with the American people, to make them available the options, to collect data from them. It beats the fax, it beats the phone, it beats paper. We'll get better at it because we have to. I mean, it's just going to be the sort of thing that gets repeated over and over again. But the thing I can't say I can most predict, but the thing I would most hope for is exactly the kind of change we're talking about, which is a recognition that engineering culture has something to bring to the conversation about civic value that cannot be replicated by more management. And if that becomes part of the larger conversation about civic value, which shows up better right now in NGOs, See, Click, Fix, Code for America, Expert Labs, and so forth, the more that gets into the large organizations themselves, the better off I think we are.
I think that makes sense. I'm going to ask if people have questions, if they want to start coming up to the microphones. And while you do, I'll sort of ask to your point on See, Click, Fix, or and other civic startups that have started to emerge outside of government. And clearly we have a new generation of digital natives that are deeply digitally literate and technical. How do we see the government collaborating effectively with the technology community outside of public institutions as well?
Well, I think the biggest change so far has been the recognition that the problems faced by national governments are almost by definition one-offs. Right? There are not a lot of problems faced by national governments that have a high degree of replicability. I remember going to the very first Gov 2.0 meeting that O'Reilly hosted, and Vivek and Anish had just showed the CIO and CTO, respectively, of the federal government, had just showed up. Everybody, oh my God, the national government is on fire. We're going to see all this incredible implementation of technology. And their opening speeches were basically apologies for how totally hamstrung they were in the ability to implement the kinds of things they wanted to. And I was very depressed. And I walked out into the hallway and I saw people from Tallahassee and St. Paul. Like, oh yeah, but we got the garbage thing, you know. And I realized cities have a very high degree of replicability. Everybody's got to get the garbage taken out. Everybody's got to do the dog licensing. So I think one of the things we see, especially with Code for America and also with See-Click-Fix, is that you start with the replicable problems. One way to do this is to start with the replicable problems first. Because once cities start to recognize, oh, if you've solved the queuing problem for your school bus system, and I can just adopt that easily, I can actually put my resources on some other problem that you can adopt easily. And I think we're going to see, also cities tend to be more technocratic and less partisan than states, and certainly right now than the national government. I think we're going to see a lot more innovation at the city level and the state level. With the federal government, we mostly want them just not to fall down and break a hip, as they have just done. So I think while all the focus is on the Fed, the innovation and a lot of what we can learn is going to come at in these much more local settings.
That makes a lot of sense. Correct question?
Brian Kayans, MIT Center for Digital Business. Going to the double loop perspective, I'd like to ask if you have any insights on why the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services was given the central oversight role in this. This is an organization that has an information-only website that apparently has no experience with interactivity. At the risk of revealing how old I am, I tried to get an automatic withdrawal from my bank.
Yeah.
I was sent a form from CMS. It was actually through Medicare. But the form had no phone number, no fax number, no email, no website. You just had to mail it in, and you were basically locked into communicating with them by mail.
So I should say, to the degree that I have any insight about that, it is only from reading the various post-mortems that have been published. I don't have insider knowledge. But the fateful decision, and this was documented in the very interesting Washington Post piece on Sunday about Healthcare.gov, the fateful decision was roughly the one you just outlined, which is, do we give this to people who have a high degree of technical facility but don't understand the politics of getting this law passed? Or do we give it to people who understand the politics but don't have a high degree of technical facility? And the decision was made back in 11, I believe, that understanding how the law had come to be was the more important of the two roles, and that it would be relatively easy to get up to speed on the technology. And that decision, fateful and wrong, was the earliest example that I've been able to find in these various postmortems of someone simply underestimating the degree to which reality was going to return, no matter how much you denied it. I will also say of CMS, although they certainly have been challenged managing Healthcare.gov, many of the statements of people, again, as far back as 6 months ago, saying we don't have time to end-to-end testing, we're just going for avoiding a third world experience here, came from people inside CMS. I mean, Henry Chow has come in for a lot of criticism, but he was an early focused voice. So even those people, not as capable managers as you would like of large-scale technology projects, did a better job than people higher up, even in the political hierarchy, at saying, we got a problem here. Now, one of the scenarios that might have happened is when those people said, we got a problem, they might simply have restructured the project away from CMS management, but even that wasn't allowed to happen because of this failure was not an option thing.
Oh, and I will say, you set the perfect example of how to ask a question, which I forgot to remind, which is to sort of introduce yourself and hopefully make it relatively brief and a question. So with that.
Hi, my name is Neha Dalal, and I'm asking this question on behalf of the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum Committee. So the internet has led to a large boom in outsourcing. To what extent, if any, has Washington been able to implement outsourcing? And if they haven't at all in the future, do you think it's likely that they're going to be able to?
No, I would say, on the contrary, that Washington has led on the outsourcing model. Clay Johnson, who runs the Department of Better Technology, has made the observation that if you want a tech startup, your co-founder better be an engineer, but if you want to sell services to the government, your co-founder better be a lawyer. That essentially navigating the difficulties of just writing a contract with the government are so significant. So what has happened in DC is that there's just been an extraordinary boom in outsourcing that has outstripped almost every other sector other than cheap plastic toys, right? I mean, it's, you know, it is no accident that the Snowden leak came from within Booz Allen, not from within the NSA, because the bolt-on function of the systems administration and so forth was outsourced. The NSA has now said we are insourcing those functions. We have actually gone too far. So the boom in outsourcing from the lowered discovery costs because of the internet and the lowered sort of ongoing communications costs has hit private industry, but as so often the government and private industry are somewhat out of sync with one another. The government has been outsourcing very significant chunks of its internal business really since the Carter administration because of the financial exigencies of the oil embargo, and then further accelerated with privatization under Reagan. So I think that we're actually likely to see a move away from government outsourcing towards more hybrids in which the significant management oversight is actually government employees of one sort or another, or where the outsourcing is moved towards smaller, more nimble organizations. Clay Johnson, who I've talked about a couple of times, has got a proposal called RFP-EZ in comparison with 1040-EZ, the tax form, which would make it easier for smaller organizations to answer an RFP. So I think the outsourcing question, very significant for Healthcare.gov, very significant for the NSA leak, is actually likely to lead to less reliance on a handful of very large-scale contractors and implementers, and to a more diverse ecosystem, including a lot more internal functions inside the government, even as private industry continues outsourcing more.
We'll go up to the top.
Hi, my name is John. I'm from the Mid-Career Program. Welcome back, Clay.
Hey, thanks very much.
I'm a big Nico Mele fan, so by default, I guess I'm
All right,
a big
very good.
Shirky fan. So my question is this. Today was voting day, actually. And so I walked down to Ward 8, the Quincy house, gave him my driver's license. They looked me up and said, "I'm sorry, you're not on our list," which was a paper list.
Yeah.
So they made some phone calls and said, "Oh, you're actually supposed to vote in Ward 2. So I looked it up on Google Maps, and I was like, where is Ward 2? I don't have time to go to Ward 2. Right. My point is this. I hold in my hand more power than Los Alamos ever had, and yet I can't vote with it.
Right, right.
So do you think that'll ever happen, and if so, what's it going to take?
I think it will ever happen. That's an easy prediction to make. Once you know, as faculty often say to one another, either give a time frame or a prediction, but never both together. The problem with voting is that it is almost never in everyone's interest equally to increase voting. So as long as there is one party that wants to suppress voting, and that party will tend to be either a minority party or a slim majority party, you know, from you know, any political persuasion, it is difficult to convince people. It is difficult to convince the people on the inside to change the system. However, I'll point you to a service called TurboVote, invented here, that is essentially trying to reverse engineer some of what you're talking about by basically doing a Carl Malamud for voting regulations, which is to say, find places where there is a vote from home option, and to make it as easy to sign up for that, you know, the name TurboVote coming from TurboTax, to make it easy as the electronic change in taxes. So I suspect that that's going to be one of those places where we see third parties innovating around the basic infrastructure of voting. And only when those things become essentially things that citizens don't just demand but take for granted will the government take them on. In my heart of hearts, I want to tell you that will be 5 years. My guess is it will be more like 10. But I think that enough states have already flipped to more flexible voting options, and that the amount of value that can be added by things like your phone from third parties who can do things like integrate it with maps and have you look up your voting district in advance will ultimately lead to citizens taking these things for granted. And when they discover that it is not the government offering those services, that, I think, is the thing that might bring some of that political pressure to bear.
Hi, I'm Chris Farley. I'm a sophomore at the college. You talked a bit about the need for phased implementation and that government needs to do things in stages. But it seems that Healthcare.gov, unlike CFPB, where you can start out with a website that has content and then you build out the feature that allows people to send in complaints, Healthcare.gov does one thing, and that is to sign people up for healthcare. And either you have a website that does that or you don't have a website that does that. So how would phased implementation have worked in the case of Healthcare.gov?
Well, so I mean, the painful fact of the matter is we have phased implementation, right? What we have is a world in which 90% of the people who signed up for accounts couldn't log in. It's just that the phased implementation we got was because of the collapse of technology instead of the planning. So this gets back to this theme of recognizing that if you recognize that reality bats last, then you have to accept that not everybody's going to be able to do everything on day one. And in fact, the desire not to believe that created exactly the situation in which that failure happened. So you could do it in a bunch of different ways. You could say, we have performance metrics for the states. And if our interaction with Wyoming leads us to believe that if you're in Wyoming, this will work well for you, we're lighting up Wyoming. But our interaction with Idaho leads us to believe that we still have work to do. We're not lighting up Idaho yet. Right? There are lots and lots of examples where you go someplace and depending on where you are, the service will or won't work for you. It is politically painful, but not as politically painful as this. Right? You could have said, we're going to limit signups on day one to people whose zip code ends in a 1 in the manner of gasoline rationing, cutting down 90% of your traffic and being able to isolate the inbound sort of looky-loo problem from the can we get people signed up problem. You can say, right now we are taking your information, but it is store and forward. You will not get an automatic quote back. We will send you an email when your quote is ready. People already interact with systems like that. It's a somewhat unfamiliar pattern. It's a batch processing pattern instead of a web-like pattern. But it is certainly the case that the government is more constrained and that a site like Healthcare.gov is closer to being a single-serving website, as it were, than something like CFPB. But even then, there are ways in which you can get phased implementation. And in a way, as we now know, phased implementation was always going to be what we got. We just got it in the worst way possible.
Hi, I'm Denise Lynn. I'm a first-year student at the Kennedy School. So I think that there's this interesting unspoken assumption in the conversation as we talk about the norm of digital delivery that citizens have easy access, ready and easy access to the internet. And I was wondering whether at this point in time you saw an equilibrium between the infrastructure and access on the citizen side and these essential government services being delivered to citizens. And if there isn't an equilibrium or we're at kind of a point where we can meet those needs, what do you see changes that are necessary for this transition into the digital norm to be effective? Yeah.
So I should have said, you're absolutely right, and I should have said the digital divide remains an issue. What's happened, I believe, is that the idea of the internet as a platform has become a norm for mainstream delivery. What now seems to be happening is that the people who don't have access to that platform are now regarded as being a special case that needs to be planned for rather than being the mainstream, right? So the history of the internet has been, when 10% of the people used it, businesses started looking at it. It only crossed the 50% mark about a decade ago. And then the curve famously slows, as these kinds of adoption curves do. We will always be in a world where some people will have to interact by telephone or fax or paper. We plainly have the telephone, fax, and paper options for a lot of government services precisely because of that. But particularly for Healthcare.gov, where the critical imperative turns out not to be signing up the poorest and the sickest, but signing up the youngest and the healthiest, the youngest and you know, middle class and healthiest, right? Getting the people into the system who are actually likeliest to use the web is the single most important economic imperative for making the idea of the Affordable Care Act affordable. So that is a place where the digital divide is not doesn't put as much pressure on the goals of the website. You could not move, for example, all of SNAP onto the web, all of the food stamp program onto the web, because a much larger percentage of your recipients would need the special cases. So we will still, and for the next 10 years, need to regard alternate modes of delivery being available for alternate populations as being absolutely part of these kinds of services. But what I think has happened is that there is now a sense that where you can use the web, the cost is low enough, the accessibility is high enough, and the quality of the inbound information is significant enough relative to any other method that we should do that if you can basically reach the 80th percentile of your audience, and then reach out to the other populations sort of one at a time. And that strikes me as a Rubicon. It's different from 100% of the people have access to the web, but 100% of people didn't have access to telephones until about 60 years after that invention. So we're going to be now and for the foreseeable future in this world of managing around the special cases. But the web as a normal case of good mainstream delivery, I think, has already been crossed over.
Okay.
Hello, I'm Stephen Tolkien. I'm a senior enterprise architect. That has nothing to do with buildings. It means I work on large IT systems. So this was a totally ordinary failure in many ways. The chief executive didn't want to slip the date, as you point out, and if you don't slip the date, then you don't do the testing. And so on. And I'll just observe one or two other things, and then I'm going to ask my question. So they had 50 contractors, 50. Like, that's an unmanageable thing. I've worked on very large projects where we're out of control with a mere half dozen contractors. And the back end's worse than the front end. Yep. There's hospital reporting that requires sending 100,000 files to interoperate with the back end, which is like completely broken, and other decisions were terrible that can't be fixed by an agile process, such as not allowing people to use their email address to sign up, forcing them to make up a new identifier for no particular reason. In any case, my question is how to build upon your idea of a post-mortem. So I've watched many projects fail in private sector, and there's never a published post-mortem.
No. Yes.
They bury the body.
Right.
However, with the help of our friends, the Republicans, who will want to ferret out everything that went wrong, we have a rare opportunity. So if this is the first time that it's just assumed that the internet's the right way to deliver services, but the system was messed up for a large variety of reasons, we can actually force the public to become aware of what went wrong, and let's not do it again. So how can we make this a public post-mortem as an opportunity?
That's a really interesting answer. So the thing I was talking about earlier, when I asked my students, essentially the question I posed to them is what could possibly go wrong? That's effectively a pre-mortem, which is to say I ask them to imagine that it fails, and then it actually elicits skepticism about their own project that's often valuable. I ran the technical subcommittee of an organization called Connecting for Health from 2001 to 2010. Our biggest, since our most widespread innovation was something called the Blue Button, the VHA data download for healthcare information. And during the course of that work, I became something of an amateur scholar of government IT disasters. And you have not lived until you've read a lot of GAO reports about the FAA. So I kept trying to introduce that literature into subsequent reports that we issued. And I know exactly what you mean about burying the body, because the really alarming thing is because it was a large, complex ecosystem, anytime you said, for instance, for the FAA was so bad at managing technology that the GAO put any technology project the FAA started immediately on the high-risk list. Not because of anything about the technology, the project. If it said FAA, it went into the high-risk slot, and it was put there until they could prove it could be taken out. But then when you try to point this out, some contractor or other has worked on that. Like, oh, could you not mention that one? So it had not occurred to me, but I think this is right. There may, in fact, be, one of the few possible silver linings of the current partisan political climate. There may be an ability to create a post-mortem that is not just published by the GAO and then buried. I don't know. I have not given that question any thought because it had not occurred to me until you just asked that question. But a real technical post-mortem that said not only did this fail in this really kind of painful way, but that this is a perfectly ordinary way that government projects fail might actually be an outcome we could get out of it. I can't say more than that because I don't know how that would happen, but it's certainly, that would be...
Well, I was hoping you'd work on it.
Yeah, well, no, it's interesting. I mean, because we've got the FAA, the FBI's virtual casebook, the IRS's failed upgrades. They had to buy a special computer to calculate Bill Gates' taxes because it had never occurred to them that the regular system would be engineered for that many zeros. And rather than upgrade the whole system, they just had to have a particular piece of the infrastructure that could manage that. But none of those failures, catastrophic as they were, widely discussed. This might be a place where we could get that conversation going. That's a really interesting idea.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Miguel Guevara, and I'm an MPP1. And in my opinion, the model of the internet relies a lot on trust. You go to a computer and you can, type your social security number or your credit card. There's a lot of trust that you put when you surf the internet. And with the recent revelations about the NSA, in my opinion, this model of trust may have suffered a breach. So my question to you is, first of all, you think the internet is entering a new phase, a new challenging phase by these new revelations about the NSA? And the second one, if you agree on that, like what are the next steps and how will the model look like in some years from now when we digest this idea that it's not as trustworthy as we thought it was?
Well, yeah, so that's a hugely complicated question. And essentially what's happened with the NSA revelations is the question of trust has moved from being point to point to being a field. Right? Point to point, it's do I trust Amazon to keep my credit card number safe? The answer was, yes in 2012. The answer is still yes in 2013. But in 2013, I know that doesn't matter in terms of in terms of someone accessing and storing my information in a way that they can get to it. As I was saying earlier to Ginny, one of the really astonishing changes in the security conversation is that it turns out that data in transit is more at risk than data at rest. We used to believe, because all the previous security breaches were about very large data stores that had been, someone had gotten access to a computer and spidered the database, or someone stole a laptop and there were 250,000 names on it, or what have you. It turns out that the real risk to trust is the in-transit stuff, because although it can still be encrypted end-to-end, the ability to decrypt it, to store it and decrypt it, has turned out to be the bigger threat. That threat is not a threat to the point-to-point trust. That is a threat to the field of the internet as a whole. And yes, we have entered a new phase, because really up until about 6 weeks ago, when someone announced that they were going to build a national internet, as Iran did some months ago, we could laugh about that because it was just a dumb idea. Because of course, if you have to have international trade, your national internet doesn't do you any good. When the Germans say they're going to build a national internet, you can't write it off in the same way. And so yes, the threat that says the internet will be re-engineered around explicitly national borders, because everything the State Department was saying about internet freedom was being undermined by the NSA in the same cycle, the damage is enormous. What needs to be done is obviously political outrage. I'm not a lawyer. I'm especially not a constitutional lawyer. But I think at least there's an argument we should have as a people about whether what the NSA is doing is not legal but constitutional. Our Fourth Amendment would seem to defend against exactly this kind of activity. And it has never been adjudicated in any public court. There are private courts, or secret courts, which is already a kind of an un-American idea. So if the NSA is allowed to continually spider everything all the time, then we are in a world in which the field as a whole becomes untrustworthy and all point-to-point transactions are essentially a second-order calculation. That thought makes me almost physically ill. So I have a hard time thinking about it coherently. I will get over it and then try and think about it. But right now, I'm like everybody else. I'm still just trying to process what we're discovering. But it is very clear that the only organization that could conceivably discipline the threat to trust is the executive branch of the U.S. government, and that's where, in as much as there's going to be political outrage, that's where it has to be focused.
Hi, I'm Jacob Moscona. I'm a sophomore at the college, and I have a question from one of Schneid's followers on Twitter. The question is, how would the US government be structured differently had the founders known about and, quote, understood the internet?
Yeah, if you read James Madison, right, we lucked out in that we had two things happen at the same time. As we had a military revolution against the colonizing power, and we happened to have a group of political philosophers hanging around looking for something to talk about. And I think we would not have gotten the Constitution we've gotten but for that second thing. So when you read Madison, particularly Federalist Papers number 10, which assumes, that's the piece that talks about factionalization and how you create isometric pressure around factions. A lot of the calculation in the Federalist Papers is about the inability to inform citizens in any kind of timely way. And so there was a very large assumption in the design of a republic rather than a democracy around proxying conversation and decision-making power to the elected representatives. And in fact, considerably more in the early days than now, right? Senators were not elected. They were appointed by their state governments, so that the bicameral model assumed an even greater remove by the citizens. At the very least, assuming the bizarre counterfactual of Ben Franklin talking to James Madison via FaceTime, I think the sense that the information gathering problem, the sense of the public representing itself in its own affairs and communicating those beliefs to their elected representatives would have come out very, very differently. The Estonian Constitution, the Icelandic Constitution, the attempted but sadly aborted, to me sadly anyway, aborted Icelandic Constitution were the first attempts we've seen at that. There are places now that are coming online and clearly going to get new constitutions, Burma being one of the, I think relatively predictable near-term examples, that will start to answer that question in an experimental way. They tend to be smaller and less ethnically diverse than the US, so it won't be a complete comparison. But I think the big question we're going to see is we're going to re-adjudicate direct democracy versus the republic. And I don't believe that anybody's going to go to all plebiscite all the time, but I think the expectation that there will be tighter communications between large groups of citizens and elected representatives is going to be a feature of all constitutions made after the internet became normal.
Great point. So final question.
Great. Oh,
no,
awesome.
no
Okay.
pressure.
So, hi, Mr. Shirky. First of all, thank you so much for coming. It's
Oh,
been
sure.
really
My God.
great hearing
It's
you.
lovely to be back. I love this.
My name's Kusha. I'm a public policy student, and I'm also a student in Nico Mele's class. So I'm
awesome.
especially excited. Good book. I really liked reading it.
Great. Thank you.
My question is about net neutrality. So right now, I can visit YouTube and Facebook and other websites that prevent me from being a productive human being.
Right.
But I can do them at the same speed, and they're all kind of treated equally by my internet service provider. I've been reading recently that Comcast and Verizon might want to bundle certain websites and make it so that I would have to pay more to reach them at the same speed. And I think that's a big threat to my rights as a consumer of the internet. I was just wondering, how credible of a threat do you think that is?
Hugely credible.
Yeah, and then also, what effect does this have on our ability to use the internet as a platform to promote social change?
Right. Well, so it is hugely credible. The person who has done, I will recommend Susan Crawford's work on this in particular, who has spent an enormous amount of time documenting in completely granular and real-world examples what Comcast in particular is up to. She has looked at Michael Powell's assertion, Powell being the former head of the FCC, Michael Powell's assertion that essentially functional competition, which is to say multiple wires into the house, will keep people honest, and has concluded that that is a fig leaf, that is not in fact the case. So this is a hugely credible threat. It is possible to say that if your frame buffer for what does the Fox say slows down a little bit on Verizon relative to Comcast or whatever, what's the big deal for America? But it is very clear that no civic organization could or would fund the go faster button. That essentially the commercial competition would have as roadkill the ability for groups that do not have and never intend to have a business model, their ability to interact with the public in the same way as any commercial service that could buy its way into a high-speed pipe. Certainly Tim Wu's answer, which is you can prioritize by media type but not by media source. This was Wu's proposed solution, which is to say you can prioritize videos over email any way you like at your routers, but you may not prioritize YouTube over Vimeo, and you may not prioritize Gmail over Yahoo, or vice versa, or whatever. That is so in line with common carrier style expectations around our phone system that the political argument is certainly there. The huge question really is the political will, right? The will of the FCC and the Obama White House to say essentially, we are here on behalf of the American population to manage these trade-offs. Net neutrality is clearly one of those trade-offs that, particularly now that the internet as a delivery system for civic services has become normal, I think we should police jealously. But I also know that the threat is very real, and that it may be that this is simply a battle that the Obama administration does not want to fight because of the other distractions. That also could be a really negative outcome for civic participation on the network.
Thank you.
Thanks. Well, thanks to Clay and thanks to all of you.
Thank
I think,
you guys. Yeah.
in terms of parting words, as someone who we still believe is an optimist and has also sort of shown us what's possible when people are connected. And given that we have sort of a room full of sort of future policymakers, existing policymakers and future leaders, what's your charge to us in terms of how we can leverage the platforms we have to create civic value and also adapt our institutions?
Yeah, I mean, let me say two things, one large and one small. The large thing is this question of options, right? When I see engineers and anyone else not having the conversation they should be having, it's almost always because they're not talking in terms of what's possible. The managers are talking in terms of what they want. And the engineers are talking in terms of what they can't do with these resources at this time in this feature list. And that conversation, it either goes like this or it goes like this. And neither a miss nor a headbutt is good. If I could change anything in the culture, it would be for the people doing the implementation and the people shaping the policy conversation to hybridize rather than to regard this as a handoff. This is a three-legged race. It is not a relay race. And when you understand that you're tied to the person you have to move forward with, you treat them differently. And that's the big cultural change I want to see. The little change I want to see, in my role as a professor, I always want to make a reading list. The little change I want to see is I want to see people willing to learn from industries that are utterly unlike their own. Almost every industry spends a lot of time telling itself, our ones and zeros are special, right? When we implement digital technology, why we couldn't learn anything from anybody else. But this business of letting reality intrude a little bit at a time, all the time, that is a discipline that works. That is what Flickr uses, what YouTube uses, what Google uses. This constant iteration of testing and learning rather than planning up front and seeing what you get at the end. And there are a bunch of examples of that that I think should resonate with people whether or not they're in your industry. So Ken Birdwell at Valve Software wrote a spectacular thing on the cabal. So Valve Software is one of the great game makers, one of the great video game makers of contemporary life. They made a game called Half-Life, which is the most widely regarded first-person shooter ever. And the story Birdwell tells says, we got Half-Life to the point where it was playable, and it was barely playable, and we could have cleaned it up and launched it, but it was bad. So we redid everything, and the huge change in management was anyone was allowed to make any assertion they liked about what was good and what was bad up until the day of playtesting. And if you couldn't get someone from the outside world to come in, and if that person didn't say, I am having fun now, your opinion stopped mattering. That's the discipline that serious organizations that want to ship technology have, which is you test and you learn. Alexis Madrigal wrote an amazing piece about Harper Reed and the Obama for America team and their game days, right? Testing the Obama for America tools and doing stuff like saying, okay, you got to get the president elected today, but oh, by the way, Amazon's entire East Coast infrastructure just went away. What do you do now? Right? They rehearsed it and rehearsed it and rehearsed it. And readings like that, things that, you may not be in the business of getting people elected, you may not be in the business of shipping video games, but if you can look at those lessons and say, what these people did on the inside, that's how it has to go in a conversation between engineers and management. And then the third piece that I would assign, just because it is so much about the mental shift that you and I have talked so much about with, as people regard their participation on the internet, is a wonderful Paul Ford piece called Why Wasn't I Consulted? And in it, Paul puts forward the hypothesis that every medium has a kind of natural mode of interaction or behavior it invites its users to engage in. And with the web, the natural mode of behavior is to ask, I could participate, why wasn't I allowed to participate? And again, it's one of those things where you have to read it with the sense not of, oh, well, he's not writing about what I'm doing, so this couldn't count. You have to read it with the sense of, how would this apply to me? But there is so many things. Learning by doing is the worst possible way to learn if you could do it any other way. And yet so much learning is, we just were the 9700th organization to make that mistake, and now we know better. I wish that there was a lot more sharing of this, we tried this and it didn't work and this is what we learned, without everybody having to go through these mistakes all the time.
So to more postmortems then.
More postmortems, more public postmortems.
Yeah.
More postmortems people are willing to learn from, because if you're not going to learn from it, why have a postmortem?
That's very true. Well, thank you again, and thanks
Thank
everyone
you.
for
Thanks
joining
very
us.
much. Thank you. That's great. Good. Yeah.
I think